Welcome, everyone, to Gramercy Books Author Night, featuring Pulitzer Prize-winning winner Debby Applegate and her latest biography, Madam, about the notorious jazz-age Queen of Vice, Polly Adler. Debby will be in conversation with Alec Whiteman. I want to thank Zeppelin Productions and Jewish Columbus for being Gramercy's community partners for tonight's author program. I'm Linda Cass. We're live streaming this program through Zoom webinar, and it will be recorded. Let me preview the next hour or so for you. After introductions, Debby and Alec will talk for about 35 minutes. That's going to be followed by 15 to 20 minutes for your questions submitted in the Q&A box, and that's typically located on the bottom of your screen if you're using a desk or laptop. This is where Alec will be taking your questions for Debby during that latter portion of the program. And you can write your questions in this box at any time. Those questions liked by others will be upvoted, which means they'll rise to the top of the Q&A box, most likely to be asked. Another tool is the chat box. This allows you to chat among yourselves, but it will not be monitored by the panelists. We hope your chats don't distract you from what will be an intriguing conversation tonight. I want to draw your attention for a moment to the chat box. So right now, do click onto that icon. It will open a column on the right of your screen with links to 3 upcoming virtual author programs. Although at Gramercy Books, we are and will continue to host in-store programs given our vaccination and mask requirements for attendees. So on Thursday, December 2nd at 8 p.m., Gramercy Books is co-hosting with publisher Random House and other booksellers nationwide a one-night-only live-streamed event featuring best-selling author Dr. Brené Brown to launch Atlas of the Heart, Mapping Meaningful Connection and the Language of Human Experience. You can also find in our chat box the first 2 January events that we've listed. The first being on Tuesday, January 11th at 7 p.m. And we're going to do our Gramercy Book Club that night featuring The Ballerinas. It's a captivating novel about a trio of ballerinas who meet as students at the Paris Opera Ballet School. After the book discussion, author Rachel Kapelke-Dale will be in conversation with our 2 moderators instead of 1, Ballet Mets, Edward Ling and Sue Porter. And that book will be available in early December, so use the holidays to read it and get ready for that book club. And then on Tuesday, January 18th, Gramercy Books is thrilled to host Penn Faulkner awardee and author of Snow Falling on Cedars, David Gutterson, in a virtual conversation with longtime WOSU public media host Christopher Purdy about Gutterson's upcoming novel, The Final Case. We encourage you to click on the link for any of these programs to learn more about them, as well as to register if you'd like. And you can check out our website, gramercybooksbexley.com, to learn more about all of Gramercy Books' exciting author programs. Now let's meet tonight's guests. Madam is Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Debby Applegate's compulsively readable and sometimes jaw-dropping story about the life of Polly Adler, the notorious Queen of Vice, who played hostess to every gangster, politician, writer, sports star, and cafe society swell worth knowing, and who, as much as any single figure, helped make the 20s roar. Written in cinematic prose, Madam is a thoughtful exploration of the dark side of the American dream. It will be enjoyed by fiction and nonfiction readers alike. Debby Applegate is a historian and biographer based in New Haven, Connecticut. Her first book, The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher, won the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for biography and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Book Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. She's a graduate of Amherst College and was a Sterling Fellow in American Studies at Yale University, where she received her PhD. Debby, it's a thrill to welcome you to Gramercy Books and to share your exciting and noteworthy book with our Central Ohio community.
It is an honor, tremendous honor. Thanks to the staff of Gramercy and thanks to Alec Whiteman for inviting me.
And in conversation, Debby, is Alec Whiteman. By day, Alec is a partner in the national law firm of Baker Hostetler, but during his free time, he promotes national act singer-songwriter concerts in Columbus, and he's been doing that since 1995. He's also a longtime member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where he served 3 years as chair of the board. He shares his passion and knowledge of music in his recent memoir, Music in My Life. And it was in that capacity, actually, several months back that Alec learned about you, Debbie, and your novel, and subsequently making me aware of it so I could pursue you to join us tonight. Alec, welcome back to Gramercy Books, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thank you, Debbie. It's actually an honor for us to have you with us. I've done a few of these interviews for Linda and for Gramercy, but this is the first time I've interviewed somebody who's just appeared on the CBS Sunday morning show. Not to mention a wonderful review in the New York Times Book Review, and you're on a roll with this book. We're going to spend much of the next hour talking about Polly Adler and your book, but if you don't mind, let's take a few minutes and talk about you. Who are you, Debbie? Tell us a little bit about your background and obviously leading into the whole writing process. As Linda said, you'd written one book before this one for which you won the Pulitzer Prize, but it's been 15 years. What the heck you've been doing in that time?
Now, see, I wasn't prepared for a question like that. That's tougher than the usual question. I think that most historians don't really like talking about themselves. That's why they got to go out and spend a whole bunch of time focused on other people. Who am I? I'll tell you what, I am a little library mouse who has spent the last 13 years sitting with a bunch of dead people, and I found my imagination is quite broad, but my experience in life has gotten much more limited in the last few years, especially trying to finish this. I was an obsessive reader. That's why anything to do with the bookstore, I really appreciate. And I think that I found myself in the world of writing, not because I always felt like I had to have something to express, like some people really do have to write. And I admire that so much. I think it was just because that was the only way I was going to get to hang around books all the time. It was the only way I was going to get to hang around old stuff. I liked antiques. I liked old letters. I liked hearing old folks talk about their stories. So I think I found myself down this primrose path without actually necessarily choosing it. But the real problem is I've only done 2 books, but they take so long that I may not have it in me to write a third one. So you caught me at a bad time. I'm not really quite sure what this crossroads holds for the future.
Well, tell me how you picked the subject of this book and a little bit about that research process. And in fact, in our 30-second dress rehearsal, I understand you're actually in Los Angeles, not in New Haven, where you've had a reunion with members of Polly Adler's family. I didn't know I was walking into that. So tell us how you picked this subject and how you went about researching it.
Well, the research, I love questions about research because I'm obsessed with research. That's the part I really like. The hunt, the following your hunches, the sort of Sherlock Holmes part of it. The writing is just the hard part you have to do to pay for my time in the library. My first book was about a 19th century minister who had been forgotten mostly, but had once really been the most famous man in America. He's probably now remembered, if at all, as the little brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the classic novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was an anti-slavery guy. He was from a family of Puritan ministers, the last of the Puritan ministers. And when I was done with that book, it was just, it was overwhelming. I had worked so hard. I had thought I would never write another book again. I guess I don't have any children, but I have a feeling it's like having a baby, that you're like, well, that can't be done again. But it went kind of well. And people were saying, oh, you should do it again. And I think also like having a baby, you forget how hard it was to do that the first time around. And my editor had said, well, if you're going to write something, why not the 1920s? The 1920s, the Fitzgerald, Hemingway, the Round Table, jazz, all the things that the glamour and the grit of it. And I thought, well, let's just look. And I was in the library at the Yale Library, and I found a little book in the 1920s stacks. And it was a little red, scarlet red book with a parrot on the front of it. And it was the memoir of this woman, Polly Adler. I'd never heard of her, but it turned out she had been the most famous madam in 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the Jazz Age New York. And the book was terrific. I mean, it included gangsters and politicians and writers and you know, the biggest names, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Whitneys. And I just fell in love with her. I fell in love with her voice. She had a broad-minded, big-hearted voice with a great self-deprecating sense of humor. And like that first book, she was a little like a Forrest Gump kind of character. So she was meeting all these people. She knew all these people. Things were happening in her space, in her little parlor there, that brought together all kinds of strands of American culture, music, Hollywood, politics, all kinds of things, crime. And I thought, well, something could be done with her. What I did not know was that it was going to be so hard to jump from ministers to madams, from virtue to vice. Took me a little while to get my head around those saints. They may not have always been saints, but they wanted to do well. Now we were just in the land of unrepentant sinners. So that took a little while, just mentally, to make my... And then the research, which is my favorite part. And I really lucked out. I shouldn't keep going on and on about research, but I could go on for days. I found two tremendous things. One was a cache of photos and papers that had been saved by Polly. She was a pack rat. Most of it had been thrown out by her brother after she died because he was very ashamed of her. He did not, most of her family did not appreciate her career, despite the fact that she supported them, brought them over from Russia, paid for everything. They took her money, but they would not have her at the holiday table. They would not have her for religious holidays. But those papers had just tremendous amount of all photos and things you would never know. The other thing I found was an old suitcase that some junk dealer had found when he was cleaning out an old office building that had all of the notes from Polly's ghostwriter, all of the names that had been cut out. There was a list in the back of the notebook, one of her notebooks that said, "shall not be named" in the book. And it included the names of every single living major gangster that was still around in the 1950s. And so that was enough to get me going. And once I started down that route, then just resources kept opening up everywhere you looked. So that in the end, I spent about 13 years in that rabbit hole.
Well, we're going to get to all the good stuff, but let me stay with the process for a second, because I'm fascinated by it. When I got done reading your book, I actually made a note to ask you, how does a historian end up writing with all those wonderful descriptive words, the adverbs, the adjectives, like a great novelist? And in doing a little research for today, I saw others have asked you that question. It wasn't just my reaction. How do you end up with such attention to detail, such facts, writing so well, if I do say so, so readable?
Well, that was one of the big differences, was in my mind, the 19th century voice sounds very different. Harriet Beecher Stowe does not sound like Walter Winchell. So part of that time I spent was just reading gossip columns, reading crime stories in the tabloid newspapers, which now you can get online. I mean, that was one thing that changed tremendously over the course of time, is all these sources that were digitized that I could see. So you could as a reader, your voice, you start to hear the voices a little bit different. So there was a lot more Broadway wise guy, a lot more swearing, I can tell you that much. I tried to keep keep the swear words and the ethnic slurs down, but that is clearly a very different world. The world of gangsters is very different than the world of preachers. And so one of the things I tried to do is not just describe the world, what it was like to be in the streets of Times Square when every block had 10 speakeasies and a pool hall on it, or when you have the streets filled with chorus girls and big guys wearing pinstripe suits, and that I wanted people to be able to see it visually, but I also wanted them to hear it. So you try to use the language that your characters use. Not always, you don't want to sound like you're doing some kind of bad imitation, but that's one of the ways that you start to feel like you're in a world, is if you can hear how people sounded. And that's one of my biggest trick, I would say, changing the language slightly.
But it wasn't just the 20s, the gangster era. You captured that same, you captured a young Russian Jew, a girl. You captured the town in Russia and the Adler family and that whole immigration process. In my little bit of research, I don't think you're Jewish. Don't think you're Russian.
Although my husband is.
Well, maybe Bruce helped. I don't know. But how did you capture that?
Well, so that was one of my, sorry, now you got me back on the research again. That was one of the things that was also very exciting. There were two other huge, tremendous blessings that came in the research process, besides the cache of documents, the two caches. And one was after the Holocaust, when many of the towns that had Jewish residents were just wiped out during World War II. So Polly is from the Russian Pale of Russia, in an area that was partially Poland and now is Belarus. And in the time when there were many, many Jews coming over from Russia to get away from anti-Semitism, they were coming to the United States. Well, after World War II and the Holocaust, many of these places really, they may exist, but there were no longer any more Jews there. They had either left or been killed. And so the people who emigrated to Israel, who still remembered these little shtetls, these little towns, they would get together and they would create what they called Yitzkor books, which are memorial books, where people would write up their memories of the people and the places and the practices of these little towns. And I found one for Polly's village. It was mostly written in Hebrew and Yiddish, so I had to get a translator for sure. that I could not do that myself. But there were even mentions of her father there before he immigrated. And that was like a miracle, to realize that these people had gone to such trouble to try to preserve, at least on the page, these places that had disappeared. That was like the gods looking down upon me. That was tremendous. The other thing was, because of the miracle of the internet and social media, I met one of Polly's cousins who was starting to do genealogy. And over the course of the time I was working on this book, she became a master genealogist. And she recreated the entire Adler family tree, and she introduced me to newfound cousins, and helped solve a million puzzles, because historians are great at research. But genealogists do something very specific and very different. It's its own specialty. So that was a godsend as well. And that allowed me to see what her childhood was like in a way that I would never have before. It's very different world she came from.
Well, let's talk about Polly and start with the childhood. She comes to the United States. She ends up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and then ultimately Brooklyn. And it's clear from the book, and you make the point that for all intents and purposes, she grew up without a mother. But it's more than that. I mean, she didn't have guidance. She didn't have affection. You say at one point she was in an environment she didn't even have responsiveness. How much do you think that contributed to whatever it is, the independence, I'll say amorality? We'll get to Manhattan in a second, but how much did that contribute to what she ended up being?
Absolutely critical, because she had a great childhood. She had a very close family. She was brought up to be educated and to be strong and helpful. She helped work in the business. She knew how to help run a house. But when she immigrates, she's only 13. She's going to be the first one. They can't afford to all come. The whole family can't come at one time. So they send her over first. And then she's going to earn money, and they'll send the money back, and then somebody else will come over, and then the family will very quickly be reunited. The problem is World War I intervenes. She's only been in the United States 6 months, and all of a sudden the war starts, and her family is still in Russia, and she's here all by herself. She's 13 years old, living with strangers. That is the moment where she has to start deciding for her own fate. And frankly, a 13-year-old girl alone in the world, in the big city, with no one looking out for her, it's very easy to go down the wrong path. I mean, frankly, it's very easy to starve. As it is, she ends up working in a corset making factory. She's making $5 a week. She is running around. She doesn't have a lot of supervision. She takes her pleasures where she can, but there aren't. And then she finds herself pregnant. Her boss rapes her. I mean, let's just be frank. It's a matter of workplace sexual assault, we would now call it, but they didn't have the words for that at the time. It was just taken for granted that men might take advantage of you. And she finds herself pregnant. He won't marry her, which is heartbreaking to her. So she ends up having an abortion because she has no way to support a child. Well, that's very expensive. She gets kicked out of where she's living with her cousins. And now what is she going to do? And for a lot of young women, then and now, that is a moment of tremendous stress and trauma, and she's essentially homeless. And that's when she decides, look, I can make $30 a night turning tricks, and I make $5 a week by working an honest job. And if I can, at a certain point, when you feel like the world is against you, where you don't have a break of any kind, nothing, nobody's looking out for you but yourself, the idea that you can take care of yourself like that, it may not be respectable, but it brings you a certain kind of power. It brings you a certain kind of self-respect almost. You're not being trampled upon by the world, but you are taking matters into your own hands with your own resources. And that's when she ends up deciding she's going to go into the world of the sex trades. And that, I think that remains true for a lot of people. It's nobody's first choice, but sometimes it's their best choice.
Well, you said in the book that she had fit the profile of the potential prostitute: emotional poverty, intellectual poverty, poverty of spirit, material lacks, and the lack of love, education, and hope.
Yeah.
So
that it's not, as Polly herself says in her book, not every poor girl becomes a prostitute. The ones who do are often ones who have nothing else, who don't have a structure, who don't have a father or a mother to look out for them, who feel like this is my only way of finding a place in the sun. That's how she puts it. I want to find a place in the sun.
So in many ways, at least for me, kind of the core of this book, and it's all fascinating, is the Prohibition era. And maybe I studied about it in school a long time ago. I certainly heard about it. My parents would have been kids in that age. You give it a different perspective than I might have otherwise had. The unintended consequences of prohibition are remarkable, whether it's the explosion of speakeasies, you mentioned that before, women who would never have been seen in a bar or a saloon pre-prohibition are suddenly drinking. There's a combination. I don't even know what my question is. Tell me a little bit about prohibition and those unintended consequences.
Well, exactly. What Polly even says is, listen, I would not have had my career the way I did if it hadn't been for prohibition, because as you were just saying, what it does is it takes this whole world of vice and drinking. And before, if you wanted to have a beer, you could go into a saloon. A woman wouldn't go into a saloon, but a man would, and it was perfectly respectable. Now, if you want to have a beer, you have have to consort with criminals. You're going to be sitting next to somebody who is a lawbreaker, and not just a lawbreaker. It might be a kneecap breaker, might be somebody who's a murderer, because it's criminal world. All of a sudden, this whole world of criminality is given a kind of glamour and a kind of access that people didn't have to it. The word that was commonly used was slumming. So all of a sudden people wanted to be, it was chic to go slumming. It was glamorous to be hanging out with bootleggers and women of the night in a way that's a little hard to imagine. It's almost like the way Studio 54 maybe was in the 70s, that you would probably never have hung out with those people during the day, but at night when the moon is out and the liquor is flowing and the drugs are flowing, everything suddenly looks a lot more fun and a lot more glamorous. And so for her, she calls herself, what she says she's running as a speakeasy with a handy harem. And I think that was probably more common than we might even realize. And so instead of just running a brothel where you did your business and you left, she starts attracting people who like writers, entertainers. She attracts a lot of the major bootleggers who have now become celebrities in New York City that are reported on in the gossip columns and in the newspapers. And her house, her disorderly house, as they would call it, her house of joy, as was another phrase, becomes kind of like a underworld salon where all kinds of people start to mix. It's a little more upscale than a lot of brothels, so it seems less seedy, and you feel like you can sort of safely mix with the underworld. But then you get to go home and you sleep in your own bed at the end of the night.
Let me remind our participants that you and I are going to do this for another 10 or 15 minutes at the most, and then we're going to let others ask their questions. There's that Q&A thing on your screen, and if you click on that and put your questions in, I'll do my best to ask them when we get to that point. So she goes from being a prostitute to a madam. She's a businesswoman. I think you said she's got the skills of an office administrator, a talent agent, and a den mother. Clearly, she has to recruit talent. The Ziegfeld Follies, and we're going to get to some specifics in a second, but she's got high-end, I think at one point, whether it's her word or your word, she had debutantes, which were called debutramps. I mean, these are some high-end girls.
Well, that was one of the things that I found puzzling and a little shocking, because of course she has a full book. She operates by sending people out on dates, but also having a sort of central house that people can come to, as I say, like a little speakeasy with a harem. But she's also dealing with people over the phone. I'll send somebody to your hotel room, or I have an extra apartment. You can meet your date there. And a lot of the times, the people who lived in her house and were full-time prostitutes. They were that's what they would do, hustlers, as they like to use. That was the phrase they preferred. But plenty of them were young women who, there was no social safety net then. There's no welfare. There's no temporary help if you find yourself unemployed. So a lot of the women who were trying to be actresses or showgirls or dancers or even other professions, they're coming to New York City because it's New York City, and they're gonna make their fortune. Well, it's not so easy to make your fortune in New York City, especially on the stage. And so what she would do is she would approach all kinds of young women in the ladies' room at the nightclub or in the beautician's shop, and she would say, "I hear you're trying to make it on the stage." Or I know I know you're on the Ziegfeld Follies show this year, but when it closes, you're not going to have any work for a while. Or maybe you want to earn a little extra money. You want to earn enough money send home to your mother, or buy yourself a fur coat. And if you need some money, if you find yourself without enough way to pay your rent, or if you find yourself in need of extra, you just come to Polly and I will find some work for you. And she would secretly send out people who were quite respectable. Sometimes they were debutantes who'd fallen on hard times. Sometimes they were actresses who just were between jobs. And they included, she says, at least a handful of them went on to become pretty big stars in Hollywood. Now, she does not, she's very discreet. She's very concerned with not ruining any woman's reputation. But in some of the private notes that I have, she mentions, the one that shocked me was Dorothy Lamore, who maybe some of your audience will remember was in the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road to movies, very famous. The sarong girl was what she was famous for wearing her sarongs. But that was not uncommon. At one point, Jack Dempsey liked to tell a story that Polly tried to recruit a very young Katharine Hepburn, saying, if you ever need money, you just come to Polly. Here's my only question is, you're an unusual looking type. Would you be willing to wear a nurse's uniform? Now, I don't know that that's absolutely true. And I'm pretty sure that Katharine Hepburn politely declined if it was true. But you can see that she was always looking. And that is perhaps one of the less attractive parts of this story. It's one thing to say you're helping women when they need a handout, when they really need a way up out of the gutter. But it's another thing to say, hey, you're actually recruiting people who had never thought to do this work before.
Well, you can kick my shins over the internet, but Joan Crawford.
Well, now I want to say that
Martha Ray.
Okay, that Martha Ray was one of her very, very best friends, and I do not have proof that Martha went out on a couple dates, but she was very young, very poor, young showgirl when Polly met her. She was trying to hustling jobs in nightclubs at the age of 14, and was mostly illiterate. So, that's exactly the kind of girl who just feels like I just need something to keep me going until I can make my big break. Joan Crawford. Now, I will say this: there were some little rumors. There were always rumors that Joan Crawford had turned tricks before she became pretty big in Hollywood. There, in fact, is a big scandal that has always been rumored that there was a stag film that she made that was circulating around Hollywood to try to blackmail her for years. That is something I cannot prove, but I think it just goes to show, though, how often there were a lot of rumors like that. Same thing with Lucille Ball and Barbara Stanwyck and Jeanette MacDonald, people you would never guess, but at the time that was the rumor. Well,
perhaps less shocking on the double standard on the side of the guys, but whether it's vaudevillians like the Marx Brothers, James Thurber, or Columbus, Ohio, a native here. You mentioned Astors and Vanderbilts and Whitneys and Rockefellers and Harriman. The big one is FDR. Well, and at least a suggestion that perhaps she kept that secret in exchange for ongoing payments for years and years and years, long after he was gone, probably.
That was a very big shock to me, because I have evidence that Winthrop Rockefeller was that was in Polly's FBI files, for example. She herself, I'm certain that Jock Whitney was a very good friend of hers and a very good customer of hers. She's very clear about that, and the Vanderbilts and all that. She's very, and many of the entertainers like Milton Berle or Desi Arnaz, they talk about it themselves. So those I know. So I felt comfortable talking about them, and I knew that politicians went there because it was a place where if you were a crooked politician and you wanted to meet up with a gangster who wanted to bribe you, or a businessman who wanted to bribe you, it was a great place to do it. was very private, very secretive. You know, girls can be grease in those kind of underworld deals. But the Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that one I had never even contemplated. I think, like a lot of people, I am an admirer of President Roosevelt, who many people regarded practically as a saint at the time. But I was talking to an elderly man. He was in his late 80s at the time, and he had known Polly when he was a young man in his 20s, and she was near death. She had already been suffering from cancer, and she was very hurt that her parents had hurt her feelings by telling her that they did not want her to have her at the holiday table because because of who she was, because of her profession, even though she was supporting them. And she'd been brooding about how unjust the world was and how hypocritical the world was. And this older gentleman said that one day they were driving, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, she said, "Well, would you introduce me to your mother?" And he says, "Well, of course I would introduce you to my mother. Why not?" She said, "Well, my mother won't have me at the table." And then she stops, and she's obviously thinking and brooding. And then she says, you know, I knew Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She just says it out of the blue. She's an old lady. She's not trying to prove anything. She's not trying to make a case. It was like she just wanted to tell somebody near the end of his life. That was his impression. And he said she didn't give a lot of details, but she said that he had been a customer before he became president, probably around the time that he was running for governor, or a little before he ran for governor. And that when he ran for president, there was a deal struck that she would keep that ironclad secret, never breathe a word of it, and that in exchange, she would get regular payments for the rest of her life. And that's what she said. Now, I spent more time than you can imagine. If you add it up all the time, months on this question, because that blew my mind. That one I was really, and I found good circumstantial evidence. I spent time in all the gossipy ways going through the medical records for FDR to figure out what he could do and what he couldn't do, and in his personal life. And it turns out he did love a good stag party. Every year, he always threw himself in big stag party for his birthday, even in the White House. And there were other connections that made it quite likely and quite possible. However, I could never say for sure. So I just try to lay out the evidence and allow the reader to decide for him or herself, because it's a big deal to be calling a former beloved president a customer of a whorehouse, if you will.
Well, one thing you can say for sure is that her business was hopelessly intertwined with organized crime.
Absolutely.
I mean, and you mentioned before, I mean, when prohibition drives drinking and other vices,
Yep.
Yeah, behind closed doors, it's a perfect opportunity for organized crime to take over. So whether it's everybody from Meyer Lansky to Bugsy Siegel to Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, at a point in time, Al Capone. I mean, she's right there. The other aspect of that is something helped her dodge the prosecutorial authority 92% of the time.
That's right. Oh, she only one time did she ever go to jail, and even then, and she got 5 days off for good behavior.
Locally, and the feds.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think was going on there, and in particular at the federal level? Well, it's one thing to pay off prosecutors and judges and so on. What's the explanation for why the FBI, and you talk about it in the book?
Well, and that was one of the great things, is she had an extensive FBI file. So I really was able to go and look at all the back reports. And there are two things. I think even though the FBI was cleaner, if you will, than the local vice cops, that was one of the shocking things, was how corrupt the vice squads were. And I think they still, in many police forces, are if there's going to be corruption, it's going to be in the vice squads. but that was less of a surprise, I think. But then so that's how she got off on the local level, mostly just keeping her, paying off the cops, and then occasionally paying off the judges. And there was an organized ring, basically, to bleed the women and keep them out of jail. The FBI, it's interesting, the FBI wants to get something on her. They definitely are trying. J. Edgar Hoover himself says, let's try to find something on her. And I think there are two things going on. One is, I do think actually the FBI, head of the FBI in the New York office was pussyfooting around a little. She was very good friends with Walter Winchell. Nobody needed to find themselves deep in. Walter Winchell was a very good friend of J. Edgar Hoover. So I think there was some desire on a local level to not push too hard. But then the other thing was, if it's a federal crime, the only crime they could really get her on was what we call the Mann Act, which is transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. And one thing she was always very clear about is, I will be transporting no women. I will be sending no women across state lines. They will have to figure that out for themselves. And she wasn't even recruiting. In fact, in the FBI files, they asked prostitutes and pimps, gee, do you know anything about Polly? And they said, oh yeah, we all know. She has a national reputation. She turns away 30 people for every one that she hires. She doesn't have to recruit at this stage. People just come to her because it's known that you make so much money and that she's a good boss and a fair boss in an ugly business. And so she manages, plus there is, and I know we have to go to some questions if there are any questions. Maybe I have covered all the bases on this dirty book, but that a lot of, because she's so connected to syndicated crime, to organized crime, there were always rumors that J. Edgar Hoover had close ties to Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, that maybe even they were blackmailing him. And so there have always been some rumors that the FBI kind of left them alone, left the organized crime area alone. It's a mystery that has really never been solved, actually, not just at Polly's level, but for all of those guys.
If anybody has any questions, put them in the box. If not, I'm just going to keep asking you questions for a few more minutes. Either I'm asking all the right questions or you're giving all the right answers. I'm not sure which.
Well, or it could be you have a very respectable audience who would not, does not want to touch the subject with a 10-foot pole.
So Prohibition comes to an end. And surprisingly to me, you said those first few years after Prohibition were in many ways her glory years. She had an established business. She keeps rolling. You've got Frank Sinatra. You've got, for gosh sakes, Desi Arnaz, who apparently is, a regular. I love the Joe DiMaggio line that she had to replace the satin sheets with cotton ones because his knees kept slipping. I mean, so she's playing at the top of the game. But, World War II is on the horizon. I think at one point you said her customers were older and getting worn out.
Yeah, or else they were young soldiers,
or they were young soldiers and they were gone. And she goes to LA. I mean, there's a little bouncing around, but she ends up in Los Angeles. And obviously Vice moved west. Show business and all the bad stuff associated with it ends up in LA. You've got all those names I mentioned to you before end up in Las Vegas. But she changes. And the end of the book, that the changes she goes through and the struggle she had writing that memoir. You've obviously talked to some family members. I don't know whether any of them really knew her at the time. What happened to Polly in that world?
Well, it's funny because she didn't want to be a criminal. There was she wanted to be a somebody, but this was the only path. This is the only way she could figure out how to be a somebody. And it was very important to her she had always wanted to get an education, but of course, couldn't have had to quit school to go to work. She had always wanted to have her own business that was a legitimate business and to have respect. Respect was very important to her, and respect was the one thing that was in very short supply. She had plenty of money and plenty of friends and plenty of power, but respect even from fellow criminals was in short supply. And so when she retires, she's only about 45 or so, but it's a young person's game, staying up all night in that world. But she's saved a lot of money. She's got a lot of stocks. She's got a lot more hidden assets than I think I was ever able to trace. Even just last night, talking to one of her cousins, they were saying that one of her brothers had $100,000 in stock certificates stuffed in his mattress at the time of his death, which came from her, which I did not know. Otherwise, I would put that in the book. But what she wants is an education. She goes back to high school. She gets her associate's degree from Los Angeles City College. But what she really wants is to write her own book, write her own autobiography, which, by the way, not as easy as it sounds. And it takes her years. She finally has a friend who helps her ghostwriter, Virginia Faulkner. And this book, when it takes a while to get it published, because her name is a little bit too hot for most publishers, and this is in the early 1950s. The 1950s are a very conservative decade, but there are some other things happening. Alfred Kinsey has just published the first Kinsey report on sexuality for men. He's about to put out the second one for women. There is interest. So the year she finally publishes the book, she finally gets a publisher who's going to do it. It's the same year that Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex comes out, which talks about feminism. It's the year the Kinsey report on women's sexuality comes out. It's the year Playboy is begun by Hugh Hefner. So there's a moment where she is adds the last voice to that quartet that kind of blows up sexuality, especially female sexuality, in the 1950s.
There's also the Kefauver report.
That's right.
So there's a fascination with organized crime at the time.
That's right. There are these hearings of organized with these, many of whom are her friends, yes. Or she's watching. She describes sitting around watching Frank Costello, who has been her friend since 1920, being interviewed by the senators and the committee on TV, which is very harrowing. She's actually she's more nervous than she lets on, actually. But this book that she publishes, it hits at just the right moment, and it becomes a huge bestseller. Huge. She sells 2 million copies. She has become part of the literati. People are treating her like a woman of letters, like a person of respect. It is, in one way, it is the answer to all of her hopes and dreams, and she loves it. In another way, however, it came at a very high price. As she herself says, even at the end, where she's so proud of herself and so pleased in making money and being treated like a big shot for the right reasons, she says, I can never be happy. I've seen too much of the ugly side of human nature. I think we would now say she had PTSD, post-traumatic syndrome, that she just had seen murders, she had seen rape, she had seen drug abuse, she had seen every ugly part of human nature. And so I think her ending, in a way, she wants to call it a happy ending. She's like a Horatio Alger story, a child who worked her way up against the odds to become an icon and to become a woman of wealth and power. But in another way, I don't think she thought it was a success story at all. I think she much rather have just, been a good Jewish girl who opened a dress shop and married a nice Jewish boy and had a family. And there's hard to know, but I would guess she sure would have traded a lot of the money and a lot of the glamour for more happiness.
On something of her deathbed, she sells the movie rights.
Yes, that's right.
And it's not lost on me. You said it's ironic that Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck, Ethel Merman, Martha Ray all wanted to play her.
Yes, exactly. She would have been heartbroken if she'd only known. She dies just before they begin making. She sells the movie rights, and then she dies of lung cancer. That generation were hard livers, so they're between the alcohol and the cigarettes and the heart attacks. They don't live long. That speakeasy generation. She's only 62 when she dies, more or less. But the movie is made in 1963. The part ends up going to Shelly Winters, who some of your readers might remember, a blonde, rather zaftig actress who was at that time in her early 40s. And I think they chose her because she could age up and age down, as opposed to those other actresses who were a little too old, perhaps, for the part. But the movie, which you can watch on YouTube, is terrible. It is a terrible movie. They make it. The 1950s or early 1960s was probably too square a decade to make a good version of a story about prostitution. Even a few years later, you start seeing movies like Jane Fonda in Clute and other things like that, and that are just much more realistic. But this is a just kind of sentimental dreck, really, to be honest. I mean, I encourage people to take a look because it's sort of fun. There was a song, the theme song, "A House Is Not a Home." It's the name of her book and the movie, and also the name of a song by Burt Bacharach, which became something of a success. I find the song even a little not that great myself, but so she would have been pleased to have the money. She was pleased to have the money, but I think she would have been very disappointed by the final outcome.
So I have a question on the private chat that has come through, and let's see if I can read it. I'm in awe of Debbie's writing process, how she organizes all that research, keeps track of it, and folds all her rabbit hole discoveries into this readable book. I'm not sure that's a question. It is certainly
sounds like my mother, to be quite honest. Well, it wasn't easy. I can say that. Yeah, I had to be much more organized over time. That because you start out loosey goosey, and then you realize it's too much. You've got to have good tracking skills.
Well, we're closing in on an hour, and I've had a blast. I hope the other participants have as well. This was great. I knew this would be fun, but this was even better than I expected.
I do worry sometimes. There is no actual sex scene. I should warn people that it is a dirty book, but there's not an actual sex scene. Not that I wouldn't have put one in. I just didn't have one. I needed evidence for that one. But I figure we can all use our imagination. Lots of things have changed in American history, but that is probably not so different then and now. I think we can have to. So I apologize in advance if anyone is offended. It's not for the faint of heart, this book.
But it's a good one. It's a great read. Thanks. Linda?
Well, what a fascinating conversation. I mean, I adored this book. Thank you so much, Debbie and Alec. And I mean, great questions, Alec. Wow. And Debbie, I could listen to you for another 5 hours. So, thanks also to the audience for being with us. Hey, if you haven't had a chance to read this story or you don't have it, this gripping story of Polly Adler, it's a must read for anyone who enjoys history, especially about the 20th century and New York City. I know we've added a link in the chat box where you can purchase a copy of Madam if you haven't already. So just thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for joining us. And I'll remind everyone, there's all kinds of links in the chat box with registrations to upcoming programs. And Debbie's mentioned her interest in books and bookstores, and we are open 7 days a week. We will continue to be open 7 days a week, 10 to 6. Holiday hours extend to 8 after Thanksgiving. Just thanks to everyone and to both of you for being with us tonight. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. So thank you.
Thank you. Tell Bruce I said hello, Debbie.
I will. Thanks, Alec. Thanks, Linda. And thanks to all of you.